Under the status quo, regions like Donbass are bombed, elections around the world are tampered with, terrorists are literally funded to run their campaigns through Putin's wallet. But even within Russia, farmers starve under the pressure of economic sanctions. These are the harms that are currently occurring and only a taste of the harms that will expand until the day that Putin passes away. Russia will be better off if Putin dies today, but so is the world. That is because Putin is a unique driving force that pushes Russia towards extremity, and this is the best way to neutralize that threat. If Putin dies of a heart attack tonight, that would be outstanding, and I will retroactively revoke my streaming consent. 3 points. Firstly, why Russia is likely to democratize and moderate. Secondly, why even if nothing changes, why Putin himself is a uniquely bad actor with regards to how his vision impacts the actions that Russia takes. And finally, why even if Russia will descend into chaos, we prefer this for democracy in the long term, as well as just the safety of the international community. On why Russia is likely to democratize and moderate. And the first piece of context we're going to provide you here is just to say that Putin does not have an immediate successor lined up. At the moment, his actions demonstrate that he is clearly trying to consolidate power around specific structures within politics. So he often swaps between the role of prime minister and president, but he's coming to the end of his presidential term and looking to do things like change the constitution to ensure that he can maintain his own power. I think that means by all knowable facts, he does not seem to have any successor that he trusts, nor a position that is set up to take over in the event that he will die, because I think for all intents and purposes, he believes that that's a long way away. But I would also note that all of his paranoia around holding on to his position of power means that he has gotten rid of anyone ambitious or power hungry that exists in circles around him. What that means is that when Putin dies naturally, it is likely that existing oligarchs will consolidate power, but also that I guess movements for democracy from people on the ground will push towards things like power sharing agreements, meaning that a more democratic Russia with more representation of people and just more moderation occurs. What do oligarchs want? And I would note on the status quo that it is just the case that oligarchs mainly just want to maintain economic security and control. We know this is true because they like their luxury, they're fairly rich folk, but importantly, they just hate the European sanctions that have been placed on them, caused directly by the behavior that Putin has carried out that has limited their ability to make money, to travel freely, and do all the things that would fulfill their lives in meaningful ways. This is evidenced, and I would note that it is true that that these oligarchs are upset about these conditions placed on them, evidenced by the very fact that oligarchs have been kidnapped by Putin to make an example out of them when they dare to say that they are not happy with the economic sanctions placed on them. I think this means that currently oligarchs are staying silent about the fact that they disapprove of what Putin is doing, but this does not necessarily mean that they love the actions that he has taken. The second thing I would note, though, is that these oligarchs are not people that are particularly keen for political power. They don't act like warlords do. I think this means that power vacuums are incredibly unlikely because it is the case that under the status quo already, these oligarchs often sit in a council and discuss issues with Putin in relatively civilized ways. They already cooperate and constantly network insofar as a lot of their businesses rely on working with other oligarchs. I think this means that when power arises for them, it is likely to be the case they get power and significant control as a group and are unlikely to fight each other. I think 3 reasons why. The first is obviously that they have a common short-term goal, which is that they want to change the path that Russia is on in order to alleviate economic sanctions that is placed on Russia and importantly on their businesses, because that monetary gain is what is most significant to them, evidenced by the fact that they all often own their own businesses and have been harmed by sanctions placed on them. I think the second thing to note is just the very fact that they do not want to fight each other, which is to say they are unlikely to do things like battle for positions of power insofar as that causes harms to their businesses, but also the kind of sneaky shit that would allow them to disempower other oligarchs because it's mutually assured destruction at the point where a power vacuum occurs. But I think final thing to say is just that it is not a zero-sum game for these oligarchs. They often all gain significant amounts of funding when they work together because they operate in different niches within Russia. I think all of this is likely to say that they are not power hungry leaders. But the second thing to note is they likely also just push for the reduction of sanctions by either significantly democratizing at the point where Putin passes away or significantly reducing the actions that Russia is currently carrying out in Eastern Europe that are the reasons why sanctions have been placed on Russia so significantly. So I think that means that you likely do get significantly more moderation and compliance with international actors like the EU that put forward the kinds of actions they would want Russia to take in order order to democratize and alleviate those sanctions when Putin passes away. But I think the second thing to note is that even if you believe that oligarchs act in incredibly selfish ways and are likely to go for power, I would note that Putin has been losing a lot of votes in his stable base, which is to say that rural farmers are worried about the fact that economic sanctions have harmed their own conditions. We know that Putin worries about this because he has taken radical actions, like he has literally poisoned Navalny on EU soil, turned planes around to arrest dissidents. I think all of this has resulted in massive sanctions that has harmed people's lives, but as a direct result of Putin's own fear of his loss of control. I think that means that oligarchs, in order to reduce these sanctions that have been placed for very specific actions, are likely to cooperate with the conditions that parties like the EU place on them, which would be to say, we would like you to elect a moderate leader, we would like you to elect a democratic leader and democratize in that sense. Obviously, this on its own unlocks a massive benefit to millions of people, insofar as the immediate reduction of sanctions would help people on the ground that are currently suffering from economic conditions, but you would also just get more democratization, which would improve lives for people in the long term when they're able to do things like vote for their own conditions. The next thing to say, though, is that even if nothing changes and you do get a power-hungry leader that comes into power, I think Putin is a uniquely bad actor. Why is this the case? He has a unique vision, which is based around his own history within the region, which is to say that he grew up within the context of the KGB, saw the fall of the Soviet Union, and specifically wants to reestablish that vision of power, wants to marry the old czars with the power that he holds. All of these things are unique to his vision. And the reason why this is important in terms of how he behaves as an actor is to say that this is the way that he sees the world and Russia's role within the world. That is why he is so specifically interventionist when he, as an actor, commands troops to go out into Eastern Europe. I would argue that no other leader that comes up in his position would be likely to do actions that would risk economic sanctions that harm people on the ground, because he's particularly irrational due to that image of old Soviet power that he holds. But I think the second thing to say is just that he markets himself within a niche of being a strong man. There's a unique niche that he fills. The first thing I would say is just that there are no other oppositions currently in Russia that fulfill that unique niche or claim to, but also it's just unlikely that anyone would try to compete on that image, because you would always fall short of what Putin was able to achieve, which I think means that it is likely that any opposition leader that arises, even if they are acting in an autocratic way, would build on an image of stability and therefore reduce the kind of interventionist actions, because they would want to be seen as a leader that reduced economic sanctions for Russia rather than continuing down Putin's path. The final thing to say, though, is that even if Meg proves that there is some level of chaos, we prefer this. The first thing I would note is that this worst case is unlikely for the very incentives we give you above. But even if so, even if it occurs and some chaos exists, I would say that all of those incentives still act to ensure that a peaceful transition does occur at some point, meaning that all those incentives coalesce to create conditions for stability and power sharing in the future. And importantly, if it looks like Russia is going to go to the point where it is a failed state, there are significant incentives on the global community to intervene and establish a stable Russia, which mitigates most of those harms for Russians in the short term, but even so is worth it, right? Given the level of Putin's escalation under the status quo, resulting in harms in Eastern European and people on the ground, we stop that immediate continuation of arming people on the ground. So proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I now invite the first negative speaker.
Hi, can I be heard?
Cool. Am I audible?
Yep, you're good.
Awesome. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Just a point of framing to start this debate off, right? I think David, as he always does, gives a very quick line of mechanisms and impacts that aren't really well weighed up, right? Because a lot of those impacts are very, very speculative, to the extent that you can't necessarily buy the whole part of that impact, given that they haven't proved necessarily that the very clear incentives that apply on all oligarchs collectively, the fact that their money is literally frozen because they have a lot of assets in US dollars because of current sanctions, that their first reaction isn't necessarily to get those short-term benefits and create economic flourishing for themselves. I'm going to talk to you about 3 things in my speech today. Firstly, why you are likely to get a much better transition of power on our side of the house, dealing with all the responses because and the case brought by their side. Then secondly, dealing with even if you get a relatively strongman authoritarian in power, why it's still better on our side, given that if that individual gets into power, a lot of their analysis about chaos doesn't necessarily apply because they're likely then to have the same incentives that we brought to you at Umbar's speech that wasn't responded to. And then finally deal with the worst case instance of separatist violence and why that is also likely to be much better in the long term. First, then, those are basically our 3 paths to victory. Some important clarifications and characterizations. The main one here being whether Putin is necessarily finding a successor in the status quo. And I think empirically, first of all, I think Umbar's analysis shows that he's not necessarily likely to do that because he's already trying to change the constitution to allow himself to have more presidential terms. Obviously, that means that there is no necessarily short-term or middle-term incentive at all to find a successor. Note again, the irrationality of the actor that is Putin sees himself as the savior and bringing back Soviet-level power, which necessarily means he doesn't really trust anyone else to continue that power. So even if there's a successor, Putin will be in the background controlling that person, which is the exact same thing that would happen on their side of the house, right? On our side of the house, it's much easier because you don't have Putin giving legitimacy to that successor anymore. The power then goes to those individuals who control all the resources. Because David himself says it's about controlling the majority of resources and institutions of the state that allow for control. What do those look like, right? That looks like control of oil. That looks also simultaneously control of the media. That is the network of oligarchs that will have the final say in whoever gets into power. But even if authoritarians who want power in its abstract sense get into power, the oligarchs still maintain control. And those incentives that we set up at first are very important because they apply on the people who actually have the power. But I want to sense check that claim that Putin is trying to find a successor, right? So if it's true that Putin has promised different individuals the ability to gain power, promised different individuals that they would be their successor, and there's some sort of absolute win for whoever gets into Putin's position without any power sharing, then it's impossible for Putin to ever appoint a successor without all those same harm happening, right? Because then you're just betraying a whole bunch of individuals by not giving them that power. So if you buy the characterization, it's likely that that problem and all that chaos in terms of fighting each other and getting resource control would happen on their side the moment he tries to then switch his power over to somebody else. Let's talk firstly, before I move into the rest of the mechanisms, the idea that it's bad to happen particularly now because of geopolitical crises and COVID. The first thing to note about COVID, right, is that it's not going to get any better on their side of the house because Putin doesn't give a shit about his individual people. They're living in absolutely miserable conditions. And the reason is because of, again, Putin's irrationality of trying to strongman control in the region that is unlikely to continue for a long period of time because he sees as escalation in Eastern Europe, his ability to get power over Georgia and Ukraine, Georgia in the past, Ukraine right now, as something personally important to him. Which means that it's unlikely that individuals are going to sit on the ground any longer on their side of the house. You might get some sort of democratic uprising, which results in chaos and stability, or oligarchs trying to take over because the sanctions get far too bad for them in that long period of time when they can't access those benefits. So Putin himself is making irrational decisions into the long-term survivability of Russia. To the extent that Putin continues on that mission, it's unclear whether those harms aren't going to happen on their side of the house either. In terms of geopolitical crises, well, obviously these are all crises caused by Russia, right? Like all the crises that Russia is involved in is because of Putin's attempts to engage in intervention in Eastern European countries and electoral intervention electronically in other European and in the US, right? So obviously those crises are not going to be handled by the new person in any sort of way. If at all they're unable to handle it, it means a reduction in all those harms that we already claimed at first speaker. Let's talk about whether you're likely to get chaos at all. The first thing to note overall is that they say there are lots of ambitious individuals who have deals with corrupt oligarchs. So what that means then, that even though those, it's first of all unclear whether those individuals are going to be worse than Putin, right? Like it's unclear what the marginal changes if those individuals get into power. But the one thing that you can see in the strands of David's analysis is that they all require the oligarchs' ability to maintain control. Why is that the case? Because the oligarchs are, and the reason that Putin maintains power right now is because he has some support from those oligarchs. Those are the oligarchs that control the Russian Times, right? The Russian media that is able to provide propaganda both abroad, internationally, but also domestically. They control oil, for example, that is beneficial for them. The next response he gives in terms of the oligarchs, so he obviously understands that the oligarchs do maintain control and can choose the successors themselves, is that they don't really gain at all from this because they have oil monopolies within Russia. First of all, that is not going to change, right? The oligarchs, because they control that power almost absolutely, it's unlikely even in our world where they're going to let competitors come into power, but they all obviously gain, right? Like the reason that the oligarchs are pushing for Nord Stream 2 to Germany is because they gain by selling oil to Europe. The moment you are less likely to have sanctions, you get massive outcomes in those instances. They say there are bad blood between oligarchs and therefore they fight each other because they might be competing against each other. That just flies in the face of what it means to be an oligopoly, right? Like they have control over industries, entire institutions. To the extent that our competitors, they're obviously colluding with each other and are happy to do so. To the extent that fighting with each other might be individually, they might have some chance of gaining complete control. It comes at all the risks we talk about. Continued sanctions, which means that the long-term, maybe plausible benefit of getting complete control comes at a cost of the short-term sanctions that they could otherwise alleviate to get actual short-term benefits instead of the speculative benefit of fighting each other. But also, we told you, that necessarily means they have less stability in that country. So all the chaos that they want to say might happen that might lead to capital flight is bad for those individuals. So again, coalescing incentives into maintaining some sort of stability, it might not necessarily be democratic stability, but it will be stability that means that you don't get the massive amount of sanctions that are on Russia at the moment because of the incentives, but also not necessarily get the same interventionist ideas on their side of the house. It's unclear why then that they would also bypass elections. Given the analysis we told you how individuals on the ground right now, because of sanctions, continued sanctions in the long term, and because of COVID, are very unhappy with Putin. The fact that Putin's natural reaction is to shoot them basically and hold them down does not necessarily mean that any other person in power or the oligarchs, when they are freed from Putin's hold and are able then to control the narrative in power, are likely to do that. Because again, all those things make it less popular for themselves, mean that they are likely to have a democratic uprising in the future, but further sanctions from the EU and less stability in order for them to become economically powerful. Again, the incentives there mean that you're likely to have some sort of power sharing or at least some alleviation of problems on the ground that Putin doesn't do because he's putting all his resources into his vainglorious attempt into bringing back the Soviet Union. So again, the unique incentives of Putin doesn't necessarily translate to all the other individuals who, yes, might be really bad militarily individuals, but unlikely to have the same vision as Putin does. In terms of separatist violence, we think that is particularly likely to happen because if it's the case that Russian nukes are going to be taken by separatists, that's when you get global intervention. Everyone has an incentive then to make sure that Russia is stable. Firstly, a reason why oligarchs wouldn't let that happen in the first place because they don't want that intervention. But even if the worst case happens, we have a solution without the harms to the rest of the world side with side.
I thank that speaker for their speech. I now invite the second negative speaker.
Sorry.
Yep, you're audible.
All right, great. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. What people look for in times of crisis is a sense of comfort. The sudden, unprepared, and shocking death of Vladimir Putin brings forth a crisis in nationalism, where the same person who had been an icon in Russia for over decades, the same person that has built the Russian national identity around himself, his background, and the kind of person that he is, will cause immense hysteria as to what the future of the Russian identity will become. What I will explain is that the person who has to deal with this crisis in identity is Putin's successor. And what that means is that they will become worse than Putin, i.e., Putin today has already done all the things he needed to consolidate power. He has quelled a lot of dissent such that he doesn't need to add any kinds of additional forms of quelling, insofar as people are already deterred and scared of what might happen next. But secondly, is that the kinds of crisis he has manufactured in the mid-2010s, clearly he has moved away from, in the sense that he annexed Georgia, he annexed Crimea, but today he is trying his best to ensure that he can provide stability in some regions because he no longer needs to prove to other countries that he is a country to be feared. What happens, however, when you put Putin at risk and make someone deal with this crisis is you have someone with a very, very weak mandate. One, because they were unelected. They were only in office because somebody had died, not because now they can claim the popular support Putin once had. Secondly, you don't have the same kind of incumbent power, i.e. people were just used to the kind of Putin government, the kinds of media and propaganda that have been propped up for years had ensured and enforced that he was the person in charge of Russia. But thirdly, I will discuss why this is likely even more later. But the infighting we discuss is likely to ensure that if you make it out of that infighting and succeed, your name, your reputation would have been dragged down to the mud by anyone else you competed with. You might be the most popular. It does not mean you have the same degree of popularity that Putin had. What you need to counter this is a large amount of projection of strength. You need to once more feel or make the Russian people feel like you are now that face of nationality. You need to once more ensure that you have the same strength Putin once had, but you have yet to prove that. You have no track record. You will look weak unless you do this. So, harms of further military expansion, harms of wanting to ensure the annexation of more states, becoming more aggressive and harming more of your neighbors are more likely to occur on their side of the house. I want to counter now their claims that, well, if the oligarchs work together, you'll have more democracy and moderation. The first thing I want to note is that no response to literally any proper noun David gives you explains that there is no legitimate opposition in Russia that is probably going to win and enforce democracy. Navalny is in prison. It is unlikely that the former prime ministers of Russia, former generals of Russia, who we name are likely to take power, would have had any interest in moderation. Just gut check that argument. But even if you believe the oligarchs could consolidate, not only does this not mean that oligarchs are the ones who will try and vie for power. I'll explain why that causes infighting later on. But even if oligarchs did consolidate, I don't know why their interest would have been democracy. At best, they name sanctions, which we explain are of difference of interest to other people, but many more things. Firstly, democracy, like Navalny was trying to do, calls out oligarchs for their corruption, wants oligarchs' money to be taxed and redistributed, ensures that they can no longer get away with the kinds of flaws in regulation that they did. Opening up your borders and wanting to be more friendly with other states in order to moderate ensures that oligarchs face more competition and that this future person in the Kremlin is likely to ensure a greater amount of backlash. So it's unclear why moderation would have been the alternative. And here's where I want you to assess this debate. They say, well, I don't know how much worse it could possibly become. This argument proves that the possibility of it getting worse and these structural incentives to ensure that it gets worse over time are likely to accrue in comparison to Putin, who is in his probably few years in office, does not need any kind of thing to prove to the Russian populace, and likely has not a significant incentive to be able to afford this. And you can tell this with Ukraine, i.e. he knows Ukraine is already scared, which is why at best he puts them at the borders. He's not likely to annex or try and do what he did to Crimea again, because his previous threats and attacks were enough to deter and control Ukraine insofar as he did. This change in this leader does not have that same promise, because you don't know if he'll do the same thing. You don't know if they're as scared, and therefore he has the incentive to make sure they are as scared. Secondly, they just completely deny infighting. So if we had to prove this, it is obviously not the oligarchs who are going to do this infighting. One, these are people who are of different backgrounds and therefore of different interests. Some of them have a history in politics. Some of them have a history within the military. And these are some people who have also tried to attack Putin. Important to note here is that Putin's ability to quell dissent has caused instability because it has deterred people from acting. But insofar as there was no incentive to cause instability, insofar as Putin is in power and has deterred these people from pursuing power, once Putin is gone, all these people with different interests, with different claims to power, with different ways in which they envision the Russian government are likely to come across. So not only is it pure assertion to say they are not power hungry, four these people are leaders of their own party, four these people have challenged Putin to an extent before, but moreover, that they're incredibly unlikely to work together. The important thing to note here is absent a succession plan, but also absent any kind of constitutional recommendation of who ought to take power, that makes things very messy. And the grab for power here becomes very unclear. So one, you can probably take more radical actions, which is not within Russia's not past, right? You can do things like assassinate political opponents, imprison them, jail them, and ensure that it is far worse. Why is this worse than the status quo? The first thing I want to note is that the people that are within the purview of Putin's enemies obviously are clear victims. But what I want to note here is that at the very least, you don't expand the view of people who will be seen as enemies by the other side versus a significant number of political leaders and military leaders vying for power, and therefore not only having the wanting to kill more people that Putin might not have wanted to kill before, but also the incentive and want to do so today, insofar as it could be the promise of political power in the future. But secondly, Russia is a country, but it is a very, very big country, i.e., these are regions with many different interests, these are regions with many different cultures, and therefore, what I would note here is the likelihood of a degree of regional conflict, particularly in the North Caucasus, particularly in places that might be a threat of annexation today, are one, likely to be riled up by a lot of these leaders to hate the rest of Russia, insofar as they no longer fear Putin's kind of deterrence. They're likely to ensure a degree of infighting, not only between political elites, but also within political groups and factions that is likely to cause a degree of violence. But the last thing I want to note here is that people looking at this as a point in which they could possibly take over Russian politics, they deal with the argument about like a lot of insurgent groups wanting to fight at about 808, which obviously cannot be credited, but they don't even deal with it very convincingly. Insofar as it's the most possible way in which you might not be able to fully gain power, but could force concessions out of governments, could curry favor with different political leaders, it is much more likely the ability for you to do this and capitalize on Putin's death today is going to occur. And therefore, significant amounts of ways in which, at best, governments will be unstable and unable to act to provide social services, unstable and unable to ensure that they can implement a lot of important and crucial government functions, but at worst, large degrees of violence, both within the political system and outside of it. Secondly, current crises. I don't think they deal with this except to say that, yeah, they can deal with it later. They wouldn't have dealt with it any better. The first thing I want to note is obviously Putin's COVID response has been sloppy, but note as well that this is an important source of nationalism for him, because the Sputnik vaccine, the ability to ensure that they don't look as weak as other nations, it is not as big a threat to him as geopolitical crises. But I would want to note their incentives to be able to stop this. Obviously, they can say these incentives exist on both sides of the house. What we argue differs is capacity, i.e., capital flight, the lack of a government mandate, the inability for an effective government to be able to meaningfully implement different things and tackle crises are less likely to be harmful. There's a big difference in this debate that I don't think they deal with. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I now invite the third affirmative speaker.
Starting in 3, 2. I'm going to look at 3 things in my speech. Firstly, will Russia moderate, and does this even win negative the debate? Secondly, about how Putin is uniquely bad versus his successors, and finally, on unrest in Russia. Firstly, will Russia moderate? Firstly, I'm going to talk about oligarchs. There are several responses we hear from the other team, most of which Shah deals with really well, right? So David says, oh, Putin's divided and conquered. Some oligarchs benefit from this. They've got bad blood because they compete. Several reasons why this isn't true. Firstly, obviously it's stupid to assume that there are multiple companies that are really powerful within Russia in the same industry, right? This is a country that doesn't have a completely free market. There's been collusion to appease the most powerful families within that nation, right? So obviously that means there are a few that have the most power that are the ones that Putin was lobbying for. Secondly, I'd say there's actually very strong relations between those families, given that they are the backbone of Russia, and they're used to talking together and, controlling what happens in government and making requests to Russia. But finally, I would say that even if these politicians are self-interested, not these politicians, these oligarchs are self-interested, they're not so stupid that they cannot understand that it's clearly bad for their business to have huge economic instability and to allow all these political hotshots to be infighting and to make huge instability, right? So clearly what that means is because it's bad for their business, they're going to choose to clamp down within about a few months or so. They're going to choose a candidate. Why is this really important? Oh, just before I move on, Mikko's only new response is that their interests aren't in the favor of democracy. We're not saying they're going to turn Russia into a democracy. We don't care about corruption as much as we care about just trying to give in to some international requests, like to stop funding terrorists and to stop invading countries which have their own sovereignty, right? So clearly there's a middle ground there. But what does this mean? Oligarchs are going to choose a leader that is stable, and they're going to do so shortly, right? They're essential for choosing leaders, firstly, just because they have all the power now, but secondly, they have control over the state apparatus in terms of media, right? They own companies which run the media. So if you as a leader want to control Russia and get power, you have to have the oligarchs on your side. So
all of this means that anything the other team has proved about infighting, about how they're going to have all these political factions rallying, isn't actually a harm, because the oligarchs had the incentives to choose a stable, relatively more moderate leader that was given to international demands, right? But also just the material about infighting requires you to believe that Putin has left alive all these political factions. He hasn't, right? Obviously, it's unlikely that all these political factions are going to pop up within 3 months and launch a huge domestic like civil war, right? That's not going to happen. But now I'm going to talk about the other team's alternative. And they sort of say that it's better that Putin dies later than now. But David never sets up why their mechanisms about Putin's death are only about if he dies now rather than choosing a successor. And I think they assume that Putin will choose a successor that consolidates power. But I want to point out that some of their mechanisms will still happen, right? Clearly, there was a big reward for Putin being president and, autocrat of Russia. So clearly, some power-hungry individuals might still make the choice if you believe their mechanism about people wanting to live up to Putin's legacy, right? They're still going to make that gamble. So I think instability still happens. And clearly, they don't just get a democratic election on their side of the house because Putin's chosen a successor, right? But actually, what I think is possible, instead of, Putin choosing a successor that consolidates power, is I think he follows the trajectory of every single authoritarian dictator ever, which is to get used to holding power, to get used to himself being the leader and the strong man of his country, and to get increasingly paranoid that he is going to be murdered in his old age, right? And so that means he's less likely to choose a legitimate successor, more likely to choose someone that's just like him, that's, just supports him and, curries favor with him and makes him feel like a good leader. So you get all the harms plus a weak leader at the end of that. I think that's terrible. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why Putin's uniquely bad. We gave you 2 reasons. Firstly, that it was his specific vision for Russia, based on his time as a member of the KGB, based on his memories from the Cold War, that means he is so willing to destroy his country's economy for the benefits of international posturing. But secondly, because his unique brand was that he was a strong man, so that informed how he got favor domestically, right? David's response is that, the commanders he supports are already bad. Firstly, unclear why this isn't what happens on their side, right? Putin chooses someone exactly like him because that's his vision that he likes. So I don't know why that's a good response. But Mikko comes up and he gives us some new stuff. Firstly, he says that Putin's successor will be worse if he has to live up to the legacy of Putin. Firstly, I think this falsely assumes that the Russian people actually like Putin's legacy, right? Firstly, I would say they're very, very scared of getting literally sent to a gulag, so it's not necessarily true that they froth Putin. But secondly, even if you talk about the fact that people really love Putin riding on that horse shirtless or whatever, I love that photo. That photo asks people to suspend their immediate reality, which is economic hardship, which is diseases spreading rampant throughout the country with no institutions to help them, get better. And just, be happy that Russian has invaded the Crimea and is invading Donbass, and just let, their nationalistic pride erase their current reality, which is right in front of them. Obviously, that falls away when you no longer have the same person telling you that myth. And so I don't think that they're going to want to live up to Putin's legacy at all. But second response here is, obviously, I think it's much harder to live up to Putin's legacy, given he's already done most of the stuff you can do, right? Like he's invaded the Crimea, he's funded all these proxy wars, right? If you were a leader, it is far better for you to say, oh, great man, Putin, love him, miss him. Now what our country needs is stability. We don't want to destroy his legacy. We want to maintain it, right? So that's why you probably don't try and compete on the same metrics as he did. You just try to compete in terms of stability, in terms of focusing domestically, right? And the next thing we hear from Mikko is that, if the leader is weaker, they will have to act strongly to compensate. But I think this misses out that Putin is already doing this to the biggest extent, right? Because Putin has provided no domestic gains to the population. In fact, every action he does on the international stage accrues more sanctions, which harm the people of Russia more, right? And that's why he has to compensate so strongly on the international stage by funding terrorists, by funding militant groups in the Crimea in order to distract from the problem that is in front of the Russian people. Clearly, no new leader could be as bad as that. This point has won us the debate because clearly Putin's death, even if it results in some instability, is going to be, good because we get rid of someone who is uniquely harmful for the Russian people and also for the international stage. Third point, though, about sort of atrocities. I'm going to note that, firstly, I think a lot of the other team's material about this is like just contingent on the point about infighting and oligarchs, which have clearly already won. So I don't think atrocities are that bad. But also, if the country is so unstable that there is a risk that, for example, Chechen rebels are going to get hold of nuclear weapons, then obviously that is the level at which you get global intervention, right? So they are only able to prove that there's some kind of moderate instability within the country. What is the harm of that? Well, firstly, I'd like to say that that harm doesn't matter compared to the international effect of getting Russia to stop its interventions overseas, to get them to stop taking actions which piss off the international community, right? And clearly, it's not going to be a long power vacuum either, right? Because of the stuff we told you about how oligarchs don't like instability, so they're going to choose a candidate to back eventually. So that means you're probably going to not have this harm be as great as they want to say it is. But also, Shah tells you that the status quo is so bad that you don't really get any like comparable harms. So like if you want to talk about instability making the COVID response worse, the COVID response is already bad. So this doesn't win the negative team the debate. One final thing I want to respond to. David sort of implies that the instability in Russia will spread to other countries and therefore it also has an international effect. But obviously that's untrue, because at the point where there is instability in Russia, you as a leader stop trying to distract people from that by sending all your army overseas. Instead, you withdraw those and you actually put those troops on the ground to help get control, to help make promises. That's why that point, the international benefits are unique for our side. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I now invite the third negative speaker.
Hello. Before I start, I would like to stop the recording.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I think the affirmative case has died of natural causes because of their inability to respond to any force of reality on our side of the house. I first want to note that the main benefit of Gov happens after the fact, i.e., you pick a successor and the successor makes Russia better. And if you believe that there is such a small difference in this kind of issue in the debate, you ought prefer the issue on what kind of immediate impact infighting might cause. I'll first deal with that issue because I don't think they win it either. So, is the successor going to be better? The first thing I want to note is their methods of being able to democratize and moderate we respond to throughout the bench, because at best, they say they want to be able to combat sanctions. We don't think that we already said there are different interests with respect to sanctions, that bigger companies are more likely to be able to weather the storm, and that kills off small companies, as we pointed out by David. But secondly, is that any kind of meaningful moderation, any kind of meaningful democratization is unlikely to occur for all the reasons we point out, that oligarchs don't want to be called out, that oligarchs benefit off of continuous expansion, that oligarchs benefit off a limited regulatory environment, and therefore, at best, this is such a small difference that you therefore put into this debate. Secondly, they say Putin is unique. They don't really explain this. They say he has a vision. They say he has a history. Not only does David name 4 people who also have a history of annexation, who also have a history of being able to be, part of the KGB, and therefore it's unclear how meaningfully different and unique this vision of Russia is. What I would say is the nuance of the argument we argue at Deputy is that he is attached to that vision. And therefore, anyone who would pursue that kind of vision is forced to have to live up to it, especially the nuance that we give of an incredibly weak form of governance that did not have an electoral mandate and only seems to be produced by the death of a leader. So what I'd argue, in fact, is that we flip this incentive, i.e., that a leader that needs to cater to the nationalistic sentiments of a country that now has their hero and icon dead is likely to ensure more aggressive, more damaging, and more punitive methods of being able to consolidate power. They never respond to this once more. Secondly, the infighting. At best, they try and deny this claim. It will not happen. They will work together. Not only do I think a third negative, do we give pretty compelling reasons that oligarchs would want to go against each other, or the context at first negative that Putin, deliberately put these people against each other, made them fight in order to ensure that they were always in check. But secondly, is that these people are not the ones vying for power. You have so many different political leaders, military leaders from different regions of Russia that want to be able to take hold of the Kremlin. But therefore, even if they all wanted power, it's unclear why any kind of meaningful consensus or teamwork and cooperation would have been the likely outcome. So insofar as this is true, there are arguments on oligarchs can have dinner together is both uncompelling, but also a small part of the context that is Russian politics, and therefore makes it impossible to believe that infighting does not happen to a significant degree. And I want you to look at the scale of these harms. In the very worst case that we posit, there's a degree of violence that exists between militaries, between sects of Russian society and different cultures and regions of Russia. Even if not, what we'd argue is being able to ensure things like cracking down on political scent of people of opposing political factions, expanding the people who will be seen as enemies of the government, because many different people are likely to be vying for power and therefore are likely to kill people who they see as political dissidents. But moreover, just that this infighting is likely to ensure you have a sitting duck government because it is not clear who holds power. It is not clear what happens next. It is not only bad because you generally want access to government services, but it's bad also because you want to ensure you can get through a series of global political crises that, even though are sloppily being handled, are far better than a government that is unstable and a government that will not have the capacity to be able to get through this. So, at best, all the attempts of affirmative to try and minimize the context of this debate and minimize the difference also significantly diminishes a lot of the benefits they provide. But what we'd like to note is that the one issue that I think they clearly lose is where the biggest difference exists, and we flip their issue as well. I'm very proud to oppose.
I think that's speaking for their speech, and I now invite the affirmative reply.
We have a few paths to victory. The first is proving that oligarchs will coalesce around a leader faster than chaos would happen. And note that Neg's only win path is chaos, and worse copycats arising from that, and that circumstance would be so bad. Noting that proving that we will avoid chaos is already sufficient to win the debate then, because it would give us a leader that is willing to make international concessions that would immediately lead to the moderation of Russia's actions. The first thing I would note is that obviously David and I offer competing characterizations of what competition looks like in oligarchies. I say there is no competition, and David contends there is. We're able to successfully defend our characterization while Neg does not. I think this means that these oligarchs have complete control, because Mikko himself concedes in his speech that oligarchs likely act in the way that we say they do, but it would be the generals that cause all the factionalization and instability. The issue is that oligarchs are so necessary for the functioning of the nation, as Neg recognizes, that they have the capacity to pick a leader they like. That is why Russia is not China after Mao and is not Libya. By their own admission, our analysis lends to these oligarchs having the capacity to choose a leader. These oligarchs have power because you need oil to pay the military, you need media to run propaganda. Tobi says if they are so powerful, they would have just overthrown Putin, but Putin was secure in his image. It is clear that no new leader would be like this if oligarchs would have control over him. Note that we give distinct reasons as to why they have capacity to elect good leaders. That is that they already have power, they already have strong relations with one another, and they know that instability will harm their business. So they clamp down and choose a leader quickly, and it will likely be a leader that balances views because they need all oligarchs on side in order to have the media and to have the economy. What are the attacks that Neg runs? The first is that Mikko says a perfect democracy doesn't happen, and then Tobi says that, oh, well, they're not going to want competition, so you don't get moderation. The issue is it literally doesn't matter, right? You make so many concessions to the international community that is debate winning, but even if it is not the case that we don't have a perfect economy, Neg never necessarily impacts what that means with regards to whether it is still not a benefit, and I say that it is. They then again present their claim about infighting and say it just happens to generals, but this requires you to believe that these factions that currently do not exist because Putin has systematically stamped them out over years will arise faster than these oligarchs are going to consolidate control. And I don't think Neg ever proves this claim. They just require you to suspend your disbelief about the immense level of power that oligarchs have. On all of this alone, we win this debate because the leader that is selected is likely to do things like give into some international concessions, remove troops from Ukraine and Crimea in order to immediately remove economic sanctions. Everything else that occurs in this debate is downstream of that result because we're immediately able to improve conditions for the people that have control in Russia, meaning that they are most likely to act in this way. Their Hail Mary then is just to say that a worse leader arises in order to try and live up to Putin's legacy if a successor is not elected. But it's unclear how likely this is or how true it is. The first thing I say is that we know that Putin will never give up control. I think from right from start, we tell you the mechanisms to elect a successor are not set up, are factually not set up because Putin is trying to maintain ways to hold on to power after the 2024 elections, and we give you analysis that explains why it lines up with past actions of leaders who want to hold on to power when that power feels insecure. But I think the important thing to note is that Neg has to stand by then Putin holding on to control and all of those levers, resulting in a continuation of harms under the status quo. Why is the new leader not a strongman though? Because they rely on people loving Russia, people in Russia loving Putin and loving the image that he presents of a strongman. But they never give you the reasons as to why this is the case, right? They just assert that crackdown will be necessary. I think we give 2 reasons to explain why Putin's particular brand of leadership is not preferable. That is to say that the oligarchs will support the new leader, so he doesn't need to be a strongman, but also that people on the ground want a change. They don't want a strongman starving them for years at the expense of their own growth. Stability is likely to win out. On all metrics, we're able to improve conditions on the ground, remove economic sanctions by making international concessions, and implement a leader that is likely to moderate himself and not act in ways that will harm people on the ground we are so proud to propose.
I think that's big of their speech. That concludes this debate. Thank you all for an excellent debate. I guess